Wow, it's good to be here. And I am going to break a Hawaiian custom. Don't tell anybody in Hawaii. Traditionally, when someone gives you a lei, you don't take it off that day, and you certainly never take it off in their presence. I'm hoping all of the kids really are. I have to take a few of these off. Tangled, and they did get tangled. There we are. Okay, I'll leave a few of them. Graduation, just a trivia, but graduation days in Hawaii, everybody gives you lei. And I have seen kids, I saw this kid one time counting the lei at the end of the day, and he'd received 64 lei. 64. Mostly flowers. A few of them, people will make lei and tuck money in, which is really cool. Of course, in the US, they have $1 bills, so they don't tuck a lot of money in, but it's the thought that counts. It is so good to be here with you, and over the next few weeks and months and years, I will get to know you. I will get to know your names. Right now, you're just this big sea of wonderful, beautiful people, and you sort of all look the same, and that's okay. I am Donald. Just a tiny bit of introduction. I'm about this tall. That's a bad joke. I should never use that. I like to be called Donald. You're welcome to call me Reverend Schmidt. If you really need my attention, call me Reverend Doctor, and I will come running because I feel like you really need me then. I tend to respond to my first name, Mr. Schmidt. Even though I'm pushing 60, Mr. Schmidt still sounds like my father. And so when people call me Mr., I tend to think that they're referring to him and not to me. But and also, I'm not supposed to point them out, so I won't point them out. But if I were going to point them out, my parents are hiding back there. And it's so cool to see them. So, yes. I also, one last confession, I have lived off and on in Hawaii for 20 years, but I am not originally from Hawaii. I am, however, originally a Pacific Islander. But whenever I would say that in Hawaii, people would just sort of roll their eyes, because the island in the Pacific I am referring to is Vancouver Island. Not quite as far south. Similar history, amazingly. And interestingly, if you ever look it up, interesting connections between Hawaii and Vancouver Island, but that's for another day. So several years ago, I was going to a church in Bellevue, Washington. If you know Bellevue, it's a rather uppity suburb of Seattle. Has a lot of Microsoft people and a lot of money and a lot of very new money. And I was going to this church as an interim. In the United Church of Christ, often they call an interim in between ministers to get them through a year or two, and they had some stuff they wanted to work on. So the process was they interviewed me over the telephone, and then they flew me in for an interview with the church board, and if the church board liked me, then I would be hired as the interim. I didn't have to go to the congregation because it was only for 2 years. So I'm over in Bellevue, and I'm doing this Q&A thing with folks on the board, and they're asking me a variety of questions, and I'm trying hard to give them, good answers. And somebody said, so if you had a favorite book of the Bible, what would it be? And I thought, well, this is a pretty cool church. They're pretty progressive, pretty out there, pretty involved in the community. I know the book I'm going to tell them. And I just got ready to answer, and I overheard this fellow say to the person beside him, if he says the book of Revelation, I'm out of here. But I swallowed hard and I said, actually, I was going to say the book of Revelation, but not for the reasons you think. And I find that so often whenever I want to say something positive about that book, I have to quickly scramble and go, but hold on! It's not what you think it is. When I think of the book of Revelation, I remember an ad for Gouda cheese. Several years ago, this TV ad that I thought was absolutely brilliant. And it was trying to introduce those of us who had grown up with nothing but Cracker Barrel cheddar, that perhaps we might want to branch out a little bit. And it said, Gouda cheese from Holland, try it, it won't bite. And I think of that with the book of Revelation. Try the book of Revelation. Read the book of Revelation. It won't bite you. And so I was kind of intrigued that it was in the lectionary for this morning, and I thought, what a wonderful, wonderful text to talk about this morning as we begin this next stage of ministry together. And so I want to talk about 3 pieces that were in that reading, but first of all, a tiny bit of introduction. And by the way, Tessa, I've never met you before, but thank you. I don't feel like I need to say anything. I was like, she's giving my sermon to them. She's not reading my notes because I don't have any notes, but you see, what we've done in the Progressive Church is we don't understand that book very easily because a lot of it was written in code, which is true for an awful lot of good political writing. Right? If you were going to write, just think about it. If you're going to write something against the government, and the government is very powerful and dictatorial, you're going to write it in code. You're going to kind of hide a bit of what you're saying so that, your audience will get it. But if someone comes along and says, I think you're talking about the emperor, you can go, nope, not me. No, I'm talking about somebody called Bob. And so it's kind of written that way, and that makes it a little harder to understand because we're not part of John's in-group that he wrote this for. And so we tend to let other people tell us what it's about, and boy, that's a really dangerous thing. For about 150 years or so, those of us in the more progressive churches have let folks in very conservative churches tell us, this is a book about the end of the world and about God's judgment, and you need to be careful or else. And just for the record, there is no or else in the book of Revelation. It is not a book about God's judgment, and it is not a book about the end of the world. So if you read it not thinking those things, you'll go, wow, this is full of really incredible stuff. If you read it thinking it's about the end of the world, you tend to read it with this sense of panic because you're waiting for the gulp part. But that part isn't in there. See, John of Patmos came from an area in the early church where there weren't a whole lot of Christians. And not only that, but before the early Christians, there had not been very many Jews in that area. So Christians were just really weird. They were the first, for most people, they were the first monotheists, which is the big fancy word meaning they only worshipped one God. They were the first of those people that many folks had ever met. And so Christians just were really, really weird and really different. And Christians did things a little bit differently than other people. And that was just extra weird. See, right off the bat, the book of Revelation teaches us something about religious intolerance. People didn't understand Christians in early days, so they just tried to make up all sorts of reasons as to why Christians were dumb and weird and stupid, and we should sort of ignore them, or at least mistreat them. It was really cool in the Kelowna paper this morning. Didn't take long to read it. It's a small paper. Wow. But it was so cool to see the pictures and the article in there about the Vaisakhi celebration in Rutland yesterday. If some of you saw that, that was so neat. Because I grew up in an area with a huge Sikh population, except, well, when I was growing up, they were mostly invisible. And when they weren't invisible, they were just weird. And they were strange, and they weren't like us, so there must have been something wrong with them. Please notice I'm putting that in huge quotation marks. But it's kind of like what I guess it must feel like to be a Muslim today in much of North America, or what it felt like to be a Jew a generation ago in our culture. That's kind of what it was like to be a Christian in the early church. People just looked at you strange. People treated you kind of weird. You weren't sure if maybe it was really worth hanging on to this Christian faith. Because it was not making you many friends. It was not bringing you success. It was not bringing you any money. It wasn't necessarily a very popular thing. And in the midst of all of that, John writes this wonderful book. He's in jail, so he's got some time to think. And he writes this wonderful book that basically says to the early church, hang in there. And hang on to the faith that you've been given. And hang on to the teachings that you have heard from the risen Christ or from those who have encountered the risen Christ, because those teachings are going to change the world. They're going to change the world. That's what John was writing about. It is not about the end of the world. It's about how Christians then, 2,000 years ago, should hang on to their faith. And when we read it 2,000 years later, it's saying the same thing to us. So there are three wonderful things in this passage I want to talk about really briefly because I killed a lot of time in the intro here. The first one is, do you notice there's no light in this New Jerusalem? John's vision, right? He has this vision of a New Jerusalem, which is simply a new place for the people to live. So for us here, think a new Kelowna or a new BC, a new area where we live and move and work and do our thing. And in this new center, he says, there wasn't any need for a light because God was the light. Now, I tell you, whenever you read the book of Revelation or whenever you preach on it, you got to keep giving disclaimers because people have done such loony things with it. I'm looking around, an awful lot of you look fairly like me in that we're Caucasian, we're pale skinned, we're, dare I say it, light skinned. And for too many years, people who looked like us and had lighter skin tended to read passages like this and say to people who had darker skin, see, light is good and dark is bad. That is not what it says. We put that in there. So we have to make sure that we don't keep putting it in there. And if we're, in places where people might have heard it that way, we have to make sure that we unwrap that. So maybe it's not talking so much about light as it's talking about guidance. John's concern isn't whether there's a light switch on or not. John's thing is God will guide you, because that's why you turn a light on, right? So you don't trip on your way to the bathroom, is the classic line in the middle of the night. And John is really saying, God is there to guide you where you need to go. You don't need anything else. You don't need to turn the light on. God is going to take you where you need to go. So when you're waking up, when you're looking at the world around you and you're thinking, I have no idea where to go next, John says, try following God. God will take you where you need to go. And that's really what John is saying to us in that part. It also says there won't be any bad people in that city. I used to really cringe when I read that verse because I've heard that verse used directly to me to tell me that I won't be allowed in. Maybe some of you have heard that too. I've had people read that verse or quote that verse to me and say, so you're not getting into the New Jerusalem. Fortunately, I've read enough and I've heard enough to realize that that is absolutely not what that says. Let's translate it to animals for a second. If I said there will be no lions and tigers and bears or mosquitoes, that doesn't mean I'm saying anything against lions and tigers and bears or mosquitoes for that matter. It's just I would kind of like to live where they're not wandering around free, because that would make me always looking over my shoulder. We have to be careful not to read things into the text. You see, it's not condemning those. It's just saying, in this place, in this new world in which we are going to live, there won't be bullies. There won't be those that are evil. There won't be things to threaten us. It will be a safe place. So it's a place where God will guide us. It will be a safe place. And right smack dab down the middle of it flows the river of life. God's giving of life to all of us will be right there in our very midst. This is such a wonderful, wonderful vision that John gives us. This is John's vision of what the world can be, and this is the vision that we as Christians need to grab hold of and realize that when we reach out to others, when we open our hearts, our minds, our arms to those in need, we move the world a little bit closer to that dream, to that New Jerusalem. I'm not an idiot. I don't assume that we're going to get there in my lifetime. But that's not God's concern. God's concern is, will you do what you can do to help us move closer to it? When you say hello to somebody, that moves the world a little bit closer to God's dream. When you give someone a cup of coffee, when you give someone a hug, when you say, come on in, when you say, how can I help you? What can I do to serve you? When you speak out for those who have lost their voice, when you reach out to help someone, anyone, we move a little closer to that dream. So why am I here at First United Church? Not just this morning, but for what I hope is going to be a while. I could just be here because Kelowna's a nice place to live, right? Or so some of you have been telling me. Hey, I arrived yesterday. It was still April and it was 20 degrees. This is okay. I like fresh fruit, lots of fresh fruit. I understand that you grow a little bit of that around here. This will be good. I could be here because I've known Cheryl for longer than Cheryl wants me to tell you. And we get along really well, and I think we're going to have a blast working together. Those aren't really the reasons why I'm here. I'm here because as I've learned just a smidgen about this church, I've learned that this is a church that focuses on trying to move us a little bit closer to God's vision of what the world can be. And I want to be with you for a while on that journey. Thanks be to God.